Matthew Nanes is an assistant professor of political science at St. Louis University, where he studies policing and domestic security in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. His new book with Cambridge University Press, Policing for Peace, uses evidence from Iraq and Israel to show that integrating marginalized groups into the police can be a force for peace. He holds a PhD from the University of California, San Diego, and has worked with various NGOs and international organizations on best practices for survey research methods. Dr. Nanes.
Great, thank you very much. I really appreciate you guys having me here today. I'm looking forward to chatting with you about insurgency and measuring sensitive topics on surveys. So I'm going to divide the talk into 3 parts. I'm going to start by talking in general terms about surveys on sensitive topics, all the things that can go wrong, and some of the best practices for fixing those things. Then in the second part, I will talk about a specific research project that I did with my co-author Dotan Haim at Florida State, where we needed to measure people's willingness to report insurgents to the authorities in the rural Philippines, obviously a sensitive topic. And so we built into our survey an evaluation of different potential methods of measuring that sensitive question. And so I'll show you some of the results on that. And then in the third part, I hope we can have an informal conversation. We can answer questions about my research. We can talk about your research. We can talk about surveys in general. So let's get started talking about falsification and response bias. So surveys provide useful systematic data about things we want to know about. I've seen social science research surveys on topics like participation in crime, attitudes about abortion, past voting behavior, future vote choice, religious beliefs, right? Things that are often sensitive or even illegal. And so the problem that we face is respondents might change their behavior if they're embarrassed about our question or if they're afraid of reprisals or retaliation. So our challenge as researchers is to figure out ways to convince respondents to answer these types of questions truthfully so that we can get accurate data and do meaningful and impactful research. This is either people refusing to participate in the survey, or they agree to participate in the survey, but then they refuse to answer a specific question, which we call item non-response. And what I want to propose is that non-response on a survey is probably worse than you realize. The reason for that is that who refuses to answer a question tends to depend on what their answer would have been, right? If your answer would be sensitive, you're less likely to respond to the question. So this again puts us in a world where we're getting biased measures and inaccurate data. Let me give you an example. When we run a survey, there's generally an underlying population that we're trying to describe, right? So this could be all of the voters in Canada. It could be all of the residents of a village in the rural Philippines, right? There's some population that we want to learn about. We don't go out and survey the entire population. That would be too expensive. It would be logistically infeasible. We draw a sample. And the general principle of survey research is that as long as your sample is representative of the population, meaning they reflect the population's characteristics on all relevant dimensions, then you can learn about the population. You can draw inferences about the population based only on your sample, okay? And so survey researchers have all these different tools that we use to make sure our sample is representative of the population. Response bias is basically the same problem, except that now it's the people who answered the question don't reflect the underlying sample that you tried to ask the question of, right? So it's ultimately the same problem that the people you are observing information about do not reflect the people who you think you're learning about. So let's put a concrete example on it. Suppose we are running a survey about insurgency in the Philippines, and we want to ask people, do you support the anti-government rebels? Obviously a sensitive question. Now suppose village-wide, the underlying truth is that half the population supports the rebels and half the population does not. Now we don't see this because we're not surveying the entire population, but let's say this is the underlying truth, right? Well, if rebels are active in the village and you don't support them, you're going to worry that if they learn that, they're going to retaliate against you. So saying that you do not support the anti-government rebels is sensitive, meaning people are not going to be super excited about giving you that answer, okay? So suppose your response rate among the people who do support the rebels is 80%. That's pretty typical response rate on an in-person survey. But the response rate among people who do not support the rebels is half that, right? So people are twice as likely to be willing to admit that they support the rebels as that they don't. So we end up with twice as many responses from people who support the rebels as those who don't. And we estimate that 2/3 of the population supports the rebels and 1/3 of the population doesn't support the rebels, which is wrong, right? So we end up with a badly biased and inaccurate measure, not because people lied to us, but because people were differentially willing to answer the question depending on what their answer would have been, okay? So all of this is to say response bias can really mess up your measurement, and we need to take it seriously. There are two basic reasons why people either falsify their answer or refuse to answer a question in the first place. Let's stick with the same theme, maybe same hypothetical survey. The next question could be, have anti-government rebels been active in your area in the last month? So there's two categories of people who are not going to want to answer this question. The first is people who don't want you to have the information. For instance, somebody who supports the rebels against the government and worries that if they tell you where the rebels are, the government is going to get that information from you. The government is going to send in the military and defeat the rebels, okay? So this person has an interest in nobody knowing where the rebels are hiding. They don't want to reveal the information to you. And when that's the case, you should reconsider running a survey. Because if somebody doesn't want you to have the information, the only way you're going to get it from them is by tricking them, which is unethical and also tends not to work particularly well. And so you end up with poor quality data, okay? So when people don't want you to have information, a survey is probably not the right tool. But there's a second category of person, which is the person who's willing to reveal the information, but doesn't want it to be linked with their identity, right? So this would be somebody who maybe does not support the rebels, but worries that if the rebels find out that they've given up this information, they're going to be retaliated against. So they don't mind you, the researcher, knowing where the rebels are, but they don't want anyone linking their answer or even their participation in the survey with their identity. So when this is the case, you can run a survey, and you should focus really, really carefully on ensuring respondents' privacy. Now, there are all sorts of different tools that researchers use to ensure respondents' privacy, running the survey in a private location so nobody can see or overhear, not collecting identifying information, not recording the address where the survey took place unless for some reason it's really necessary for the research. But the thing that often gets overlooked is that even if the data that you collect is anonymous, the enumerator, the person running the survey who's standing there asking the questions, knows who took the survey and how they answered. This is going to be especially problematic in a couple of different circumstances. One is when you have largely illiterate populations that you're trying to survey, because you cannot just hand them a pen and paper and ask them to fill in their own answers, right? They have to tell the enumerator their response out loud. And so the enumerator knows how they answered. This is also going to be especially problematic in smaller communities where everybody knows each other, because especially if you're using local enumerators, which you should, they're going to know people, right? And so even if they don't ask the respondent what their name is, there's a high likelihood that they know them, or even if they don't, the respondent might worry that they're going to run into them again in the future, okay? And so if you are violating privacy these ways, people aren't going to want to answer the question, or if they do answer, they're not necessarily going to answer truthfully. Now, researchers over the past 10 to 15 years have increasingly turned to what I call randomization devices to try to solve these problems and protect privacy. So a randomization device is a general term for randomly varying some aspect of the way that you ask a survey question, and then using that variation in how you ask the question to estimate people's responses based on differences in responses between the way the questions were asked. So you might have heard of a list experiment or an endorsement experiment. I'm going to give you an example here to illustrate. I think it's a lot easier to understand with a concrete example. So I was doing research in Iraq. I wanted to measure people's willingness to support violence against the government. I wanted to see how that varied under certain conditions. So I ran a survey in Baghdad of 800 respondents. This was an in-person survey. I hired a local company to go knock on doors and ask the questions that I wanted them to ask. Now, I obviously could not send people wandering around Baghdad, knocking on doors, saying, "Hi, would you support violence against the government?" Right? That was not going to work. So I used a list experiment to measure support for anti-government violence without forcing respondents to reveal their individual choice. So I'll show you how that works. I do see there's a question in the chat. So the question is, you just threw out that one should use local enumerators, but in simulation situations where these kinds of small localities compromise privacy, would this not be a preferred strategy? Absolutely. Excellent question. I'm going to suggest maybe we push that to the end, but do remind me to come back to it, because I think we can have a discussion about some of these trade-offs for sure. So we're in Baghdad. We're running a survey. We want to measure support for anti-government violence. And I'm going to use a list experiment. So how does this work? Before the survey started, I randomly assigned each respondent to either a short list group or a long list group. And this is happening behind the scenes. The respondents don't know that they're being randomized into one of two groups, okay? So the enumerator goes to the house, they contact the person, and they say the following. I'm going to read you a list of 4 if you're in the short list group, or 5 if you're in the long list group, strategies that citizens sometimes use when the government does not seem to be listening to them. Please tell me how many of these 4 or 5 items you would consider using if you felt that the government was ignoring your needs. So the people in the shortlist group saw these 4 non-controversial options, like voting against the government or protesting peacefully. And they said, I would do 2 of those, or I would do 3 of those, right? They didn't say which ones. They just gave a number, okay? The people in the long list group got the same 4 options, as well as a 5th option of using violence, using non-peaceful methods. And again, they said, I would do 3 of these, or I would do 4 of these, okay? So nobody is specifically admitting to using violence. In fact, they're not specifically admitting to anything in particular. Now, because people were randomly assigned to be in one of these 2 groups, the people in the 2 groups should be on average the same, right? They should have the same average characteristics. They should have the same average age. I should have the same proportion of men and women in each group, same proportion of people from each neighborhood in each group, right? Which means that on average, they should be willing to choose the same number of items. The only difference is the option to use violence for the people in the long list group, which means that across the 2 groups, any difference in the average number of items that they select must be caused by people choosing the sensitive option. So in my case, in the shortlist group, the average number of items that people would choose is 2.2 out of 4. In the long list group, the average number of items that people would choose is 2.5 out of 5. So a difference of 0.3 items. So 2.5 minus 2.2 is 0.3. So we can infer that across the sample, 30% of them would consider using anti-government violence. And again, I don't know which individuals would use violence, right? That's how I've protected their privacy. I only know that I'm estimating that 30% of the sample would use violence. Now, here's the thing. I do this for a living. I have been explaining and teaching about and using list experiments for 7 years now. I have explained this particular list experiment to more audiences than I can count. And yet I bet several of you are still not 100% sure what I just did, right? You're still just a little bit confused about how this works, how it protects people's privacy. You might even think I was trying to trick people. Now imagine that an inexperienced survey enumerator who's a part-time employee of this survey company and probably has another job that they do. Now imagine that they are the one explaining this to you, right? So you're probably a little bit skeptical. You're a little confused. You might think that they're trying to trick you. Even if you do understand it from a researcher's perspective, it's because I'm only getting sample estimates. I'm not getting individual level data. I have lower statistical power, right? And so there is increasingly a lot of skepticism about list experiments and other similar randomization devices, not because the math behind them is not sound, right? They absolutely work on paper, but they're just a little bit complicated when you go and employ them out in the real world with real people, okay? And we're getting more and more evidence that maybe they're not generating data that's as good as we think it is, okay? So this leads me into part two, which is a project largely about trying to figure out, first of all, how bad these things really are. And second of all, is there a better, simpler way that we can ask sensitive questions on surveys and still get the information that we need to get? So this is co-authored research with Dotsanheim at Florida State. It's published in the Journal of Experimental Political Science, so you can go read the full paper if you want more details. And we started with a proposal for a simpler method of surveying on sensitive topics, which is to let respondents record their own answers. So this is just like if you're taking an online survey, you read the answer, you read the question, you click on your response and you submit it, except that sometimes we're stuck doing in-person surveys. I'm going to tell you about the location in a moment, and you'll see that we really had no choice but to run this survey in person with real-life enumerators, okay? So what we wanted to know was whether citizens would report insurgent activity to the authorities, meaning to the police or to the government. And this is a really important question for a couple of reasons. First of all, citizen-provided information is critically important for counterinsurgency. The government and the military are obviously more powerful than the insurgents. And so if they know where they're hiding, they can go engage them and win. But if they don't know where they're hiding, then the insurgents live to fight another day. And citizens often know what's going on. So they are that informational link. The other reason it's important is that it provides a window into perceptions of state legitimacy and citizen-state relations, right? It's actually a fairly consequential thing whether citizens support the government and trust the government to the extent that they're going to rat out the insurgents, or if they think, oh, my life might actually be better if the rebels win, so I'm going to hide them and protect them, right? So this is a question that we care about. But obviously, it's sensitive, right? Respondents could fear reprisals or retaliation from insurgents if they say, yes, they would report them. They could also fear retaliation from the government if they say, no, they wouldn't report them. And so either of those will cause people to falsify their answers, give us inaccurate information, or to just refuse to respond in the first place. So we need to find a solution here. This is happening in a province of the Philippines called Sorsogon. It's about a 10-hour drive south of Manila. It's relatively remote. There's actually no commercial airport in the province. So you'd either drive from Manila or you would fly into the next big city over, and then it's like an hour-and-a-half drive. You can see that photo on the left. It's very mountainous, so good terrain for insurgents to hide in. And in fact, it is one of the historic strongholds for the New People's Army, or NPA. This is a communist group that has been challenging the governments of the Philippines since the 1960s. It's a relatively low intensity insurgency. So this is not ISIS in Syria, this is not Al-Qaeda. The general MO of the NPA is extortion and racketeering among citizens to sort of fund their operations. You can think of it kind of like organized crime. And then they periodically will ambush a police patrol or a military checkpoint. So there is violence going on, but it's not a battlefield. It's not the kind of violence where civilians minding their own business frequently are getting caught up in it, right? So it's a situation where it was relatively safe for us to do research there. But the moment you start talking about the NPA, people get very quiet, right? This is like an unwritten rule. You don't ask about the NPA. You don't ask about insurgency. You'll see we actually had to alter the wording of the question a little bit to not name them specifically, okay? So we had to figure out how to ask our sensitive question without it being so sensitive. The province, like I said, is largely rural. That photo on the right is probably the most urban looking place in the province. That's downtown Sorsogon City, the provincial capital. The interesting thing is those two photos are taken about 3 kilometers from each other. So it gets very rural very quickly. So this is what we're dealing with here. The other thing contextually that's important is we had to do an in-person survey. Most people in the province don't have internet access. Cell phone coverage is mediocre. I think I saw a statistic just yesterday that only about 60% of the population has reliable cell signal. So what we did is we got the list of all registered voters in the province from the government, which we think is about 85% of adults, so pretty good coverage. We randomly selected 15 names from each of 298 villages. And then we sent enumerators out into the villages to find these people and interview them. And so this is one reason why it's helpful to use local enumerators, because they knew the landscape, they knew how to get to the villages. And then once they were there, they were able to talk to people and find out where these people live in order to interview them. Now, the interview was relatively low tech in the sense that it was in person, but we did give the enumerators tablet computers. My experience is I have not encountered a single survey company that does not prefer to use tablets. They all want to use tablets. It's just easier. It's better for record keeping. It's better for data security. We designed the survey so that once an interview was finished, the enumerator would finalize it in the tablet and then it would lock. And there was no way to view the data that they had just collected on that tablet. It had to be uploaded to a computer with a password, right? So that was good. So basically the way it worked is each screen had a question or a couple of questions on it. The enumerator would read the question out loud, read the answer choices out loud. The respondent would verbally give their answer, and then the enumerator would select the correct answer on the tablet. So our key question, the sensitive question, was if you knew about the activities of an anti-government group, would you report them to the authorities? Obviously a little bit sensitive, but also really important. We needed to find a way to ask it. We also asked a non-sensitive placebo question, which was, did you complete high school? So the nice thing about this placebo question is we know the proportion of people in the province who have completed high school. So even though we didn't know whether individuals had finished high school, we had a population level figure that we could compare against to see how accurate our survey actually was. We pre-tested this. We did a pilot survey. People told us they would have no trouble telling us whether they completed high school. This is true regardless of whether they had or hadn't. Only 51% of people in the province have finished high school, so there's no stigma around it in either direction, really. And then here's the twist. We randomly assigned respondents to answer the question through one of 3 methods. 1/3 answered directly, verbally, in the way that I just described a moment ago. And this was true of both the sensitive and the placebo, so they're answering both through the same method. 1/3 answered through self-enumeration, through a process that I'll describe on the next slide. And the final third did a random response or forced choice experiment that I'll also explain. So here's how the self-enumeration worked. Because a large portion of our respondents were not literate, we couldn't just hand them the tablet. So the enumerator read them the instructions and the question, read them the answer choices, showed them the answer choices on the tablet, and you can see we used emojis to make it even more obvious. Then they handed the tablet to the respondent. The respondent selected their answer choice, advanced to the next screen, and then handed the tablet back, right? So the instructions were you'll enter your answer in the tablet yourself so that I cannot see, then advance to the next screen to keep your response private. And so one of the important things that we really wanted to emphasize here was not just telling respondents what to do, but making sure they understood that they were doing it that way to ensure their privacy, right? Because ultimately, even if the data is secure, even if you ensure somebody's privacy, they're going to answer based on whether they feel that their privacy is ensured, right? So it was just as important to make sure they felt secure than anything else, right? The third version of the questions was through a random response experiment. So the enumerator handed the respondent a coin, and said, you're going to flip this coin. Don't let me see how it lands. If the coin lands on heads, I want you to answer the next question honestly, truthfully. If the coin lands on tails, I want you to answer the next question yes, regardless of whether that's your true answer. And so the reason that we're doing this is to desensitize or make less sensitive giving a yes answer, right? If people are afraid that saying, yes, I would report insurgents to the authorities will lead to retaliation from the insurgents, they're not going to want to say yes. But if some number of yeses are just people whose coin landed on tails, then there's nothing sensitive about saying yes. And this is why the enumerator isn't allowed to see how the coin lands, because then when they hear yes, they don't know if the person would really report insurgents or if the coin just landed on tails, right? And so we trained the enumerators pretty extensively on this. We made it very clear why we were doing it. We asked them to explain this for as long as it took to the respondents, for the respondents to understand not just what they were supposed to do, but why they were supposed to do it, okay? And then here's how we get information out of it. We know that a coin is going to land on heads half the time and tails half the time, which means half of our respondents are going to answer truthfully, and half of them are going to say yes no matter what. So our true yeses, the true percentage of people who would report insurgents, is the percentage of yeses that we observe minus the 50% who landed on tails times 2, because only half the sample was answering truthfully, okay? So just like with the list experiment, we're going to get a sample level estimate of people who would report insurgents to the police, but we don't know which individual respondents would report insurgents to the police. And so everything is kept private, both in the data that we record, as well as what the enumerator themselves actually see. So here's what we found. I'm going to talk about non-response first, whether people answered, and then on the following slide, we'll look at how they answered. So let's actually start with the right panel. This is our placebo question of, did you complete high school? The darker orange bars are people who answered. The yellow bars are people who refused to answer. And so what you can see is with the placebo question, virtually everybody answered it, right? This is consistent with our piloting where people told us they have no problem with this, it's not sensitive. So it's like 99% with direct verbal enumeration answered, just under 100%, like all but 1 or 2 respondents answered with self-enumeration. So a little bit of a blip with randomized response. A couple percent didn't want to answer with the coin flip. But by and large, everyone answered, okay? Response rates on the left panel. This is our sensitive question. About 71% answered when they had to answer verbally. 74% answered when they were able to record their answer themselves. And 79% answered using the coin flip. So if we stopped here, I would interpret this as self-enumeration and randomized response made people more, more comfortable, more willing to give up this sensitive information, right? And this is what these things are designed to do. So this makes perfect sense. Some number of people weren't willing to give a sensitive answer when they had to give it out loud. A few more were willing to do it when they recorded it themselves, and even more were willing to do it when they understood that the coin flip game was protecting their privacy. And this is the level of information that we've gotten from previous studies that evaluate how effective these methods are, right? We assume that more people answering must mean people feel more comfortable, and therefore the technique is doing its job. But when we look at how people answer, there's a problem. As I told you that province-wide, about 51, 52% of people have finished high school. Looking at that right panel, that's what we get with direct enumeration. That's what we get with self-enumeration. And then it drops off to about half that with randomized response. So our sample level estimate with the coin flip game is way inaccurate for high school completion, right? We have dramatically undercounted the number of people who finish high school. And maybe people are lying, but I don't think so, right? We piloted this, we interviewed extensively. There's no reason to think that people are lying about finishing high school with direct and self-enumeration, and then they're telling us the truth with randomized response, right? It doesn't match what we know to be true. And if we go over to the sensitive question on the left, we see basically the same pattern. 61% say they would report insurgents when asked verbally. 60% say they would when they get to record their answer themselves. And only about 36% say they would using the coin flip. So this is a problem, right? Because again, if we didn't have the placebo question to compare against, we might assume that the randomized response is accurate, right? We might assume that people are lying when they say they would report insurgents to the police because they think they're supposed to say that. They think that's what we want to hear. But again, when we compare with the placebo question, we realize something's off. So what we think happened, what we think went wrong, is with the randomized response, with the coin flip technique, a bunch of people just didn't understand what we were asking them to do. And so their coin landed on tails. And instead of just saying yes, they answered truthfully. So then when we went to subtract out 50% of the yeses, we were actually subtracting out too many people because not enough people followed the instructions. Okay? So because the technique was confusing, it generated inaccurate data. This is what we think happened. Okay? So I want to run through a couple of additional findings, just sort of points of interest, things worth considering. The length of time it took to do the survey increased when we went to random response. It only increased by about a minute, so not a huge deal, right? And not enough on its own to stop you from using this technique if we think it works. But still, when you run a survey, time is money, right? And so if you're going to use these more complicated techniques that take longer, you're either going to pay more for it, or you're going to have to cut questions somewhere else. The next thing we noticed was that the random response with the coin flip was susceptible to enumerator-specific effects, meaning with the random response only, people answered differently depending on which of our enumerators was doing the interviewing. And we did not see interviewer effects with direct or self-enumeration. And again, this makes sense because it's complicated. Some people are better at explaining complicated things. Some people are worse at explaining complicated things. And so we have to account for the enumerator's abilities when we use complicated techniques. And then finally, and this was not related to survey method, the presence of bystanders reduced response rates and made people answer differently. So we absolutely attempted to do the surveys in private locations. We asked people if we could do it in their home. But sometimes people prefer to talk outside. Sometimes there's a family member or a friend already in the home, right? And so what we asked the enumerators to do was record on the survey whether there was somebody else within earshot. And what we found was people answered differently when there was somebody within earshot. And so this is a reminder to make sure we're thinking about these contextual factors as well, especially on sensitive questions, because the presence of bystanders affected responses regardless of which method we used, right? So surveying in a private location is going to remain important no matter how you're doing the surveying. So let me wrap up with 3 recommendations. The first is don't forget about the enumerator as a weak link in privacy. We as researchers do a lot of really good things to make sure we're keeping data secure, to avoid collecting identifying information, things of that nature. But often we don't account for the fact that there's a human being standing there in the room with the respondent, asking the questions and hearing their answers. So we should think a little bit more about how to close this weak link. Second recommendation, from the results primarily, is there's minimal downside to self-enumeration of sensitive questions compared to direct or verbal response, right? We saw higher response rates when we let people record their own answer, and the data was at least as accurate, right? We don't really know the underlying truth of people's willingness to report insurgents, but we know that the data we collected on the sensitive question was no worse when we used the self-enumeration than if people had reported verbally. So that combined with a higher response rate means there's really no downside. And then finally, we should employ these complicated techniques with caution. And this one is a little bit self-critical because I've just given you 2 examples from my own research where I've used these. But generally, I would say we shouldn't just never use them again, but we should be very, very careful with how we use them and make sure we're appropriately skeptical of the results. So I think we should use the grandma test. If you can explain the survey technique that you are using to your grandma, meaning someone who is smart but does not have a technical background, then it's probably okay to use, right? If you can, my grandma's 96, she's sharp as a tack, but she does not have training in statistics. If I can explain a survey question to her and she gets it, I'm pretty sure my enumerators can explain it as well. But if her response, as it was on one of these questions, is, oh, I see you're trying to trick them into giving you information that they don't want to give. Well, that's not what I'm trying to do. But if that's her reaction, that's going to be some of the respondents' reactions as well. Okay. So keep the grandma test in mind. Make sure you're doing things as simply and as straightforward as possible. So let me stop there. Let's open it up for discussions. I see we've got a couple of things in the chat. Maybe I'll start with those and then we can just open it up from there. So, okay, so the first question was about using local enumerators, right? So there's a trade-off with these sorts of things always, right? Local enumerators know where to go. They speak the language. They know the social cues and things of that nature. If you are surveying in somewhere that's a little sketchy, for example, Baghdad, you know what to watch out for. You know which streets not to walk down. And so for that reason, I think especially in a less secure environment, it's better to use local enumerators. Of course, the trade-offs that you note, Grant, are people know each other, right? And if we're concerned about privacy, you're violating privacy if they know each other. So one of the solutions is to use people who are local, but not hyper-local. So like in a place like Baghdad, a big city, from Baghdad, but not necessarily from that specific neighborhood. In a place like the rural Philippines, maybe from the next province over, right? So this is going to be really context specific. You as the researcher are going to have to be the expert in sort of deciding where along that continuum of trade-offs you want to fall on this particular survey. What's most important to you? And then you also asked, so not only do we have to double our sample to do random response for the same statistical power, but we get worse data. This appears to be the case. And I'll actually note you actually have to do more than double.
More than double, yeah.
Yeah, right. And it varies depending on all sorts of other factors. But yes, you need a substantially larger sample to get the same power. I don't feel comfortable making a blanket statement that you get worse data, because if that were always the case, then we should just throw these out and never use them. But it certainly appears that there are circumstances where you get worse data. Yeah. I think my intuition, and I don't have evidence here, but my intuition is the more educated your respondents and the more experienced your enumerators who are executing these things, the more likely the complicated techniques are to work, right? And so there probably is a version of this where people do understand that their privacy is being protected. And so you do get better data using these techniques. But it doesn't work everywhere all the time. And so figuring out where that line is, I think that's the hard part. That's going to be up to the researcher in any given situation.
Maybe I'll just push back a little bit on that. So you
Please.
did do, it doesn't seem based on the other two, categories of response types that there was a ton of reluctance to answering the question, right? So that participation bias piece it exists, but it's not like substantial, right? So I guess maybe if you're thinking about a situation where there's potentially real mortal peril, you might get something. But are you going to get anything in those situations anyways, right? I mean, the risk, if the risk is that high, people are just going to not participate at all, right? So I think my read is that, in the situations where it's going to work better, you're probably not at that much risk of having this response bias in the first place.
Yeah, right. I mean, you're absolutely right to point out that in our situation, people answered the question using random response. They answered the placebo using the coin flip. So it wasn't so much that people were confused and therefore didn't answer, it was they were confused and they gave us well, actually they were confused and they gave us the truth, and then we subtracted out the wrong people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I guess maybe the reaction here is there's so many different ways it can go wrong. And again, that's not to say that we should never use them, just that you have to think really carefully up front about the ways that could go wrong in your particular circumstance. I would do another list experiment, given the right circumstances. That's my takeaway from this. I would just be less eager to do one. Yeah. Thanks. Excellent questions. Jen asks, what would be the downsides of throwing out the confusing methods and just using self-enumeration? I found lists in randomized response confusing in many environments in the US and internationally, and I'm not sure where it would not be confusing. Like I said, I think a highly educated population that you're interested in, like maybe you're surveying graduate students on their experiences with their advisors. And it's a little bit sensitive as a current graduate student to say, I have a bad relationship with my advisor, right? So something of that nature. The downsides are minimal of just throwing them out. Aside from, we thought we had something here. Like, we as a community of researchers thought we had been super clever and figured out how to ask people sensitive questions. And now we're like maybe going back 10 years in our progress if we just throw our hands up and throw them out. But I know a lot of much more senior, much more impactful researchers than I who have done just that, right? They've essentially said, I'm not going to do these anymore. There's a great back and forth blog post and comments. And I'm now blanking on whose blog it is, but I'll try to dig it up and maybe drop the link in the chat, where it's basically the who's who of political scientists and economists, basically saying, I've done list experiments, I wouldn't do them again, here's why. And even if you disagree with what they're saying, it's still, I think, really interesting to read their takes. Yeah. Got a hand from Grant?
Yeah, me again. I'm wondering, in your specific context here, where you have, an administrative sort of thing where you sort of know the true proportion, does this not let you give an estimate of the people who didn't understand your randomization methodology, letting you adjust the responses to the sensitive question to try to eliminate that piece? Did you try that?
So if we knew which individual respondents had actually completed high school, we could totally do that. The problem is we only knew what percentage of the people in the province had completed high school.
Right, but you have proportions, right? So you can still say, 60% of our
That's a very interesting idea.
Didn't understand this.
Yeah. So my initial take is we could, if we made a strong assumption about the representativeness of the sample, right? So let's just say our sample is perfectly representative of that population figure. Then yes, we could assume, yeah, we could reduce the number of people we're subtracting out based on answers to the placebo, and then use the same figure on the sensitive question. I think where we would be taking a large leap is assuming that the same percentage of people were confused and behaved that way, falsified on the sensitive question as they did on the placebo. And that's not an unreasonable assumption. It's just a strong assumption. It'd be an interesting exercise.
Well, I think in your case, with your pre-work, you've proven that the falsification for the high school question is essentially zero, so trivial.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think you can say that your disparity in between, estimated percentage and the truth is 100% due to misunderstanding the coin flip, and that will let you adjust. In your specific case, yes. Where you've done the legwork to make sure that people are, willing to respond honestly to the placebo question. I think that lets you say with confidence that your underestimate is due to the coin flip being confusing. I would think more about that if I were you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I think you're right. Where that gets us, because it's simple math and just eyeballing those figures of results, looking at the patterns, it gets us a random response estimate that is very, very similar to the direct and verbal enumeration. And then I guess the question is, do we draw different conclusions from the research based on that exercise? I think the conclusion is still 20-something% of people misunderstood and therefore accidentally falsified, right? So the ultimate conclusion is the same, though I think what you're proposing does validate the exercise a little bit. It's a great idea.
Is these cases where you've proposed that this is still a valid, method when you're potentially dealing with something that's more sensitive, or where you think that those self-enumeration and direct response pieces are going to result in more non-response. You made that argument. So
I see what you mean. Yeah.
In this case, right, if you have that context where you can figure out the percentage who just don't understand things and then adjust, that would be the case where I could see, okay, there's a real compelling.
So in other words, it suggests that where non-response is a bigger problem or a bigger risk than falsification, we might still consider doing this.
Yeah.
But we would still need that placebo to compare against. So it's basically, so the recommendation is now you use the random response experiment, but you always include a verifiable or a second question with a verifiable response. This is excellent. I love this. Yeah, this is great.